All right, let's dive right in. We're looking at a pretty powerful idea from our source material today, and it's this. What if there are only two ways to see the world? I'm not talking about just, different opinions. I mean two completely opposite, fundamental lenses that we use to interpret everything that happens to us.
So just think about that for a second. How do you actually make sense of the world? Like, when something happens, good or bad, what's your first instinct? Your gut reaction for figuring out why it happened? Well, according to the text we're digging into, this choice, it's a really big deal. It has some pretty profound consequences for how we live our lives.
Okay, so let's break down what these two frameworks actually are. On one hand, you've got the world you experience through your senses. What you can see, hear, and feel. Pretty straightforward. But on the other hand, there's this reality based on what our source calls the principles of the Word. Basically, the teachings and promises found in Scripture. And the key thing here? The source says these two are fundamentally incompatible. You can't really mix them. So to build this case, the text starts by tackling what it sees as the main problem here, the big limits of relying only on our senses. The argument being made is that this purely physical way of looking at things, it's not just incomplete, it can actually be actively misleading. And wow, the source immediately raises the stakes. It pulls this quote straight from the book of Romans, and it frames this choice of perspective as, as a matter of life and death. So what does it even mean to live after the flesh? Let's unpack that. Now, according to the text we're looking at, living after the flesh isn't really about morality in the way we usually think of it. It's all about how you process reality. It's when your thinking is just completely dominated by your raw senses, by human assumptions, and by what the source calls the theories of men, instead of being filtered through a spiritual framework. Okay, so if relying only on our senses is the problem, then what's the solution? Well, the source introduces this alternative that it calls the Christ perspective. It's a completely different guiding principle for how to interpret life. The whole foundation for this perspective, the thing it's all built on, is one core belief from the text that life itself is fundamentally spiritual. And the argument goes, if that's true, then trying to understand it with only physical tools is like trying to measure the temperature with a ruler. You're always going to get an incomplete, and maybe just a totally wrong picture.
And here's the definition the source actually gives us. The Christ perspective is a way of seeing where everything you know, everything you believe, is intentionally filtered so it's consistent with the promises of the gospel. It's not just a small tweak, it's presented as a total realignment of how you see reality itself.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this actually play out in the real world, right? Well, thankfully, the source material gives us some really concrete examples, so we can compare how these two totally opposing worldviews operate in practice. So, the first big example has to do with our relationships, how we deal with other people. Specifically, how do you respond when someone wrongs you? The text uses this to draw a super sharp contrast. Yeah, this comparison really gets to the heart of it. On one side, the source points to the eye for an eye principle. It frames this as a kind of direct, sensory-based justice. You did this to me, so I'll do this to you. But on the other side, it presents the way of Jesus, which, as it says, operates on a completely different logic. And this quote right here is presented as the key piece of evidence. The text argument is that this command, to actually love your enemies and do good to people who hate you, that's just not a logical response based on what your senses are telling you. It goes against every natural instinct. Instead, it has to be a principle that comes from that other spiritual perspective. Okay. The second major example the source brings up is health and well-being. And let's be real, this is an area where our physical senses, pain, weird symptoms, what a doctor tells us, can feel totally all-consuming. The text argues this is where these two perspectives clash in the most dramatic way possible. And here is the really stark contrast the source lays out. It says the sensory-based world's view basically endorses and accepts fear, disease, and uncertainty as just a normal part of life. But in direct opposition to that, it argues the gospel's view assures something it calls divine health as your actual inheritance. And this is key, no matter what your physical senses might be telling you. So what's the big takeaway here? The source doesn't just leave this as some abstract theory. It frames this whole thing as a conscious choice you have to make, and it even offers a practical guide for how to actively choose your lens, especially when you're faced with a tough situation. So here it is, the practical playbook the source offers for when you're dealing with a physical symptom. Step 1 is simple. You notice it.
But step 2 is the crucial one. Don't panic. You have to refuse to let that sensory data dictate your entire response. Instead, the instruction is to go to the Word. Consciously shift your perspective over to that gospel view, and then actively affirm that divine health is your actual reality.
And that, right there, is really the bottom line of this whole argument. It all comes down to a choice. The text is urging us to make an active decision to interpret life through the lens of the Word instead of just defaulting to the story our senses or our culture is constantly telling us.
And all of this really brings us to one final big question to think about. What truly shapes your reality? Is it the external data that's coming in from your senses, or is it the internal framework you consciously choose to see everything through? It's a really powerful question to chew on. Thanks for joining me for this one.